King Richard the Lionheart often has a very fond portrayal in history, a kind of everyman leader. But who was Richard I anyway? Today, I want to take a look at Richard's personality in light of his actions during the Third Crusade. I hope to see how he was an incredible leader and an incredible personal soldier, but also had his faults. He was very undiplomatic at times and often had trouble working with other leaders, which in the long term would harm the causes he would commit himself to. Our first example of Richard's ability in the face of battle can be seen at the Siege of Acre. Now, Crusader forces had attacked an enemy fortress at Acre, and Richard's English contingent had just now arrived. Unfortunately for Richard, though, he himself was out of commission, being struck with scurvy. He didn't let that stop him, though. He had two men carry him around the city on a litter, from which he used a crossbow to pick off enemy sentries. It's almost comical as it may seem to us. It was an incredible morale boost for his army, showing how their leader, their king, even at his physical worst, was still able to make his mark in battle. Once Richard recovered from his sickness, though, he set his mind to work, building and using siege equipment, which quickly caused the fall of the city. And though the fall of Acre is a great example of what Richard could bring to the table, we also see some of his faults make an appearance. You see, after the fall of Acre, through an unfortunate series of events, Richard mortally offended a Germanic prince named Leopold. And while this doesn't come into play immediately, keep it in mind as we'll see it come back later. After the fall of Acre, Crusader forces continued on to Jerusalem, and they were constantly harassed by enemy forces, with skirmishes breaking out along the way. Richard himself was almost constantly involved in these. He loved throwing himself into the middle of battle, and often would do incredible personal feats in order to rescue his men. Once, one of his courtiers recommended that he maybe hold himself back and try to avoid endangering himself. He responded with something that I think is pretty telling as to his personality. He said, and I quote, "If I am not willing to go where I have commanded my men to go, then I have no right to be called a king at all." This philosophy of leadership has long been heralded throughout history as a highly effective form of inspiring soldiers. From Leonidas holding the line with his Spartan brethren to George Washington exposing himself to enemy fire during the American Revolution, we can see that commanders who are willing to do everything they command their men to are highly effective throughout history, and Richard the Lionheart was no exception. Though Richard was highly effective in the smaller things, in the everyday rallying of his men, in the long term, though, he, through some fault of his own, ultimately doomed the Third Crusade. You see, because of personality clashes and Richard's larger-than-life stature, often other leaders would become jealous of Richard's ability and popularity with the men. As a result of this, Philip of France and multiple Germanic leaders left, leaving Richard heavily outnumbered in the Holy Land. Because of this, Richard was forced to sue for peace and head back for home. Unfortunately, as Richard sailed through the Mediterranean, disaster struck once again. A storm blew up, and he was shipwrecked on the coast of Germany, in the lands of who else but his old enemy Leopold. The Germanic prince had not forgotten the slight Richard had done to him, and decided this was the appropriate time for some payback. He threw Richard in a dungeon, and kept it on the down low, so nobody knew where Richard was, and assumed he had just died at sea or something. Fortunately for Richard, though, he was not fully without hope. Some of his loyal friends and followers didn't give up hope and searched for him. Eventually they found him and spread the word. Because of massive efforts of the people of England, Richard's home nation, and other common folk, who Richard had become enormously popular with, Richard was eventually released, though. And as this is kind of the conclusion of what I want to look at Richard, I think it's often kind of poetic how this ended. We can see that Richard's faults definitely weighed him down. His lack of diplomacy and ability to connect with other leaders did get him into quite some trouble. But ultimately, his ability to inspire the common folk and his popularity with just the everyday man ultimately shone through and was able to make him victorious in the end. And I think this is ultimately a very good picture of Richard. Did he have his faults? Yes. Was he a great politician? Probably not. But ultimately, he was a great leader because of what he was willing to do for the everyday man. So I think Richard ultimately, despite his faults, was quite deserving of his title of King Richard the Lionheart.